On Gold FM and also on FBC TV, this is Speak Your Mind, and I'm your host, Gwen Magoon. Now, the UN General Assembly designated the 19th of August as World Humanitarian Day. As a lead-up to the day, we are speaking today to the UNICEF representative for the Pacific and acting humanitarian coordinator for the UN, Mr. Sheldon Yett. This morning, we'll touch on the value of humanitarian work. We'll also find out how the villagers of Nakinda in Naitasiri led a humanitarian response. The Oxfam Fiji country director, Chovesa Salakondoka, will also join us a little later on the show as our second guest on Speak Your Mind. Good morning, Mr. Yett, and welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. It's great to be here.
Now, to begin, World Humanitarian Day is a UN-designated day. What does this day recognize?
Well, this day recognizes the important and frontline role that humanitarian workers play in natural disasters and in what we call complex emergencies, politically led disasters all around the world. It is a day in honor of Sergio de Mello, one of the world's greatest humanitarians, a man who unfortunately lost his life along with the lives of 20 other people in the famous Canal Hotel bombing in Baghdad in 2003. He's somebody I worked very closely with and worked under in Burundi several years before he lost his life. He was a great leader and a true humanitarian.
Mr. Yett, could you tell us about the plans for World Humanitarian Day 2018 as a global event?
It is a global event. It really talks about the role of humanitarian workers and the importance of ensuring that humanitarian workers themselves are not a target. Unfortunately, one of the trends that we are seeing around the world is that humanitarian workers and civilians are increasingly caught up in warfare and caught up as targets and as victims when states collapse, when we have unrest. And it's really talking about why they cannot be and should not be a victim, why they cannot be and should not be targeted, and what we need to do to protect them.
Moving away from the globe, in the Pacific, how is this day commemorated, and what opportunity does the World Humanitarian Day provide for UN agencies in the Pacific, national governments, and also humanitarian partners?
Well, let me take a step back. Humanitarian action is about workers, but most importantly, it's about responsibilities and leadership by government. Governments are the ones who take charge and have accountability for their populations under their protection. This day celebrates and shows the work of humanitarian workers working hand in hand with their partners in the UN, with their partners in civil society, under the leadership of government to meet the needs of those most affected in emergencies. What we'll see here is some great photography done by our partners that will be on display at the FNPF Plaza from Friday to next week, talking about our role, talking about our work, and talking about what people can do to be part of the responses in humanitarian emergencies.
Yep, we'll have more details on that photo exhibition that's coming up. But right now, let's just touch on the Pacific Humanitarian Team, on coordinating the Pacific 2018 World Humanitarian Day with UN OCHA. Tell us about the team.
I think it's very important to remember that effective response always happens through strong coordination. The role of the Pacific Humanitarian Team is to ensure that all of us work well together. All of us work well together under the leadership of host governments. What the team does is it divides up responsibility among the partners based on the comparative advantage. Sometimes Agency A has a better location or has a particular mandate in a particular area, be it education, where it's our friends from Save the Children and UNICEF, or in shelter, where it's our friends from the Red Cross, or communications, our friends from WFP. So it parcels out responsibilities and provides a structure for strong coordination to make sure that we are all saying the same messages, that we're all working together, that we're all doing assessments together as well, that populations who have been affected don't have to deal with partners from Agency A coming on the ground, and then 3 days later, partners from Agency B and partners then from Agency C, that we're doing it in a coordinated fashion and being clear about the resources required for an effective response.
On Speak Your Mind this morning, we are speaking to the UNICEF representative for the Pacific and acting humanitarian coordinator for the UN system, Mr. Sheldon Yett, and also in recognition of World Humanitarian Day, a Pacific Humanitarian Heroes photo exhibition will be set up at the FNPF Downtown Boulevard. That's on the 18th, 20th, and the 24th of August. And of course, on the show, we'll have more details. On Gold FM and FBC TV, this is Speak Your Mind. I'm your host, Gwen Magoon. Well, Mr. Yett, just very interesting. You know, in recognition of World Humanitarian Day, it was interesting to find out that you're a humanitarian hero yourself. Why don't you share with us your experiences? I mean, you worked in a conflict zone, and like I said earlier, everybody wants to save the world. I mean, I'd love to go and carry the wounded, but I don't think I'm really cut out for that job.
But frankly, I'm not a hero. I'm just doing my job, and my job is to work and carry out the mandate of the United Nations. I've worked in conflict zones all around the world for the last 20 years. I worked in Rwanda during the genocide there. I later worked in Burundi during the war there. I've worked in Somalia, Kosovo, Congo, Central African Republic, many different places. But of course, I think it's really important to remember that agencies like the United Nations do play an extremely important role, but they're not a substitute for government. Governments have to be in charge. Governments have the accountability under human rights law for caring for their populations and providing a response. UN agencies can help governments get the resources they need, can help with coordination, can help ensuring that best practices are in place. But governments must be in charge. And we're happy in the Pacific that that is the case. And we work with governments to ensure that best practices are in place.
Okay, well, just continue with our, the Pacific Humanitarian team. Some of the lessons learned, in the Pacific, we've experienced several natural disasters like TC Gita and Josie and Kenny and also Winston. What are some of the lessons learned from the humanitarian approach to disasters?
Well, I think one of the most important is that unfortunately, what we call the CNN effect. Headlines often dictate response. But we also know that those off camera are often those people who are suffering the most. Those who are maybe disabled, those for whatever reason are not comfortable being in the camera's eye. So we really need to drill down and make sure that we are serving and providing support to those who are most vulnerable and those who don't have a voice to speak up themselves. We also have learned that coordination is often the first casualty. There's often a temptation for everybody to do whatever they can to help. That's a great impulse, but that can also be a disaster in a disaster. The last thing a community needs is NGO A parachuting in, and NGO B parachuting in, and NGO C parachuting in, and people not working in a coordinated fashion. That is provides added stress and an added burden to both government and to communities. So we've learned, and we have to do a better job in coordination. We've also learned that we need to base our response on very strong assessments, knowing really what the information is. Sometimes first looks can be deceptive. We need to go on the ground, work with government, interview people, and have a very comprehensive look at what the needs are and ensuring that we respond in a holistic way. There's a temptation often to look at structures, physical infrastructure first. But what happens in a building, what happens in the child's heart and a child's mind is often far more important than the physical infrastructure. And the time to rebuild that often is much longer than what it takes to build a new building. And that's also something that we need to keep in mind. Sometimes the biggest impact are the things that we can't see.
And also in disaster, in terms of preparedness, what's been done to build the capacity of humanitarian workers and partners and, to some extent, national governments too?
Well, we've got plans in advance. That's one thing that we've done. We've worked together. The PHT has worked together with governments to make sure everybody knows what their role is, what the scenarios are likely to be, where the areas that we're going to have difficulty are going to be, to make sure that we have response plans in place. And we're doing that, and we have them all across the Pacific. That's one thing that we've been doing. I think it's no secret to anybody that the number of natural disasters and the intensity of natural disasters has certainly been on the increase. We know that we have our work cut out for us, and we know that the need for the response is only going to increase. We know we have to be ready. We know we have to ensure that schools are reinforced. We know that we have to ensure that health systems and health centers are ready. We know that communities themselves need to be ready. We also have learned that there has to be very strong communication, not just from top down, from central government to local government, but from local government to central government. We have to have those information systems and those coordination systems up and running. And we have to have ways of getting the word out to make sure that those who are in a position to respond are able to respond, not just to those who have the loudest voice, but those who have the greatest need.
Well, coming up on the show, we're going to touch on what's being planned to mark World Humanitarian Day. On Speak Your Mind, well, World Humanitarian Day is on the 19th of August. And of course, this morning, our guest is the UNICEF representative for the Pacific and acting humanitarian coordinator for the UN system, Mr. Sheldon Yett. Mr. Yett, would you, be able to share with us other lessons from, other humanitarian partners and emergencies from around the world?
I think one of the most important lessons is that we're seeing a lot of non-traditional partners being involved in humanitarian response. On one level, that's a very good thing. We always welcome additional resources, additional interest, and the additional capacity of those who are able to respond. But on the other hand, it can be a difficult way to ensure that the needs of those most affected are actually being met. We see the role of the militaries being involved increasingly in humanitarian response. Again, this can be a good thing because militaries around the world often bring tremendous capacity to the response. But militaries address issues very differently from the way humanitarians do. Humanitarians look to ensuring sustainability, not just ensuring that the Band-Aid is put on, but ensuring that communities and those most affected are able to respond and able to have greater independence. Militaries often respond differently. They look at the political imperatives. They look at making sure their nation's flag is flying, not necessarily looking at the primary needs of those most affected. So we need to ensure that militaries are also incorporated into how we respond, that we don't have parallel responses, that we have one coordinated approach to a situation. There's also a tendency to rely on the private sector. Again, this can be good. The private sector has a lot to teach the public sector, has a lot to teach humanitarians and UN agencies and NGOs. But we also need to keep our eye on the ball, and that is on the needs of those most affected. We need to ensure that the private sector does not recreate the wheel, does not reinvent the wheel, and that the private sector is adhering to best practices and adhering to humanitarian principles, that we don't have the profit motive taking precedence over the humanitarian motive.
And how about communities? We're trying to engage communities as well as partners. How can communities be involved? And is this also, I was going to also ask the Oxfam CEO this question, the involvement of communities, is this also reforming the way that humanitarian work is being done?
Well, communities have always been involved, but what we're learning is that top-down approaches don't work. In development work, we know that it's very difficult to be effective if you don't have a meaningful dialogue with what we call stakeholders, everybody involved. It's easy for people with fancy degrees from nice universities in the United States or Western Europe or Australia to come in with best practices. But what works well in one humanitarian situation may not work well in another humanitarian situation. Communities differ. We have to listen to those people on the ground, those people most affected. We have to listen to their needs and how they see the response, how they want us to act. We have to follow their guidance. We have to follow humanitarian principles, but we have to work with them. If we just come in and parachute in with a pre-packaged way of responding to a particular situation, it's going to be a failure. They need to be involved. They need to be part of it. They need to help us come to the best response to those most affected.
Mr. Yet, we're also confronted by new humanitarian challenges like climate change. From a UN perspective, what are the future challenges for humanitarian action? You did mention this earlier too, with disasters becoming more catastrophic.
One of the issues we face is, again, we are all often dictated by headlines. Headlines and newspapers, news shows like things that are flashy. They don't like fancy scientific theories. They like things that go bang. Wars, civil unrest. Climate change sneaks up on us. It's hard to see, and it makes it hard to talk about it. But we know that the big natural disasters are intricately related to climate change. We know that's the case in the Pacific. It's absolutely clear to us that we need to be working with those communities on the front lines. We need to be working with school kids in school, making sure they understand what's at stake, making sure that they are giving messages back to their communities, making sure that issues of water and sanitation, for example, are understood, making sure that issues of hygiene, all of these things are impacted by climate change. When it rains, we often have flooding. When you have flooding, you have disease propagation. We need to make sure that kids know how to keep themselves safe, and that they can be a vector, that they can pass on messages to their own families. These are the kinds of things that we need to build into what we do on a daily basis. In the Pacific, it's very hard to draw a line between development work and humanitarian work. We know they go hand in hand, because the Pacific, of course, is on the front lines of climate change.
Mr. Yates, just in recognition of World Humanitarian Day, could you, please tell us what's being planned to mark this day in the Pacific, and also the launch on Friday and the photo exhibition?
Yes, I'm really excited about our launch on Friday at F&PF Plaza, which will look at some great photos from the entire range of humanitarian partners, our friends from civil society, from the Red Cross, from Oxfam, from the UN agencies, looking at humanitarians in action in the Pacific. It'll show the role of communities, the role of humanitarian partners, and the leadership of government in response. It's going to be on place for a week, and I think the most important thing to remember, we chose a location very consciously. We didn't want it to have it in a stuffy gallery. We wanted to have it in a place where the public could have easy access, where people passing by could see it, so they could understand that they too have a role to play here.
In recognition as well of Pacific humanitarian partners, maybe you'd like to, mention them as well in recognition of this day.
Well, of course, our partners are our friends from Oxfam, the Red Cross, the entire Pacific humanitarian team. Our friends from government, our friends from Pacific Disability Forum. It's really a huge range of partners. I think the point is that no one UN agency, no one NGO is doing it alone. It's all about coordination. It's all about response. It's all about ensuring that we're working together to meet the needs of those most affected.
So, Ms. Yet, is there anything else that you'd like to add?
No, I think it's important for people to understand that they too have a role to play, that humanitarian disasters touch all of us, and all of us have to be prepared. It's not the responsibility of another UN agency or an NGO. It's all of our responsibilities. And the accountability remains with government. We're here to support. We're here to help. And we're pleased to be with all of you today.
All the best in your preparations for World Humanitarian Day, Mr. Yet. And yes, speaking to us then, UNICEF representative for the Pacific and acting humanitarian coordinator for the UN system, Sheldon Yate. And of course, stay on the show, because coming up next, we will be speaking to Oxfam Fiji Country Director, Chovesa Salondoka. On Gold FM and FBC TV, this is Speak Your Mind, and also in recognition of World Humanitarian Day, we're also speaking to the Oxfam Fiji Country Director, Chovesa Salondoka. Thank you so much for your time and welcome to the show. Okay. To begin, Chovesa, I know there's so much development programs that you support as Oxfam, but today we'll look at Oxfam's role in the humanitarian sector. But before we begin, could you give us some background on Oxfam?
Oxfam is an international organization that works in the poverty space. Humanitarian is a given, so we do a lot of work across the globe on humanitarian. So where there is a disaster, where there's an emergency, you will often always see an Oxfam presence. We physically got established here in Fiji in 2015. The Oxfam in Fiji office officially started in January, and Tropical Cyclone Winston arrived in February. So it was all good timing in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and speaking of, Tropical Cyclone Winston, one of the largest disasters in recent times, during the first critical weeks of, Cyclone Winston, what was the humanitarian response that Oxfam undertook? And maybe you could give us numbers of the people that were mobilized.
Sure. Oxfam International focuses on two key areas of a response. One is on emergency water, hygiene and sanitation, and the second is on emergency food security. So any kind of technical support that is provided, it's mainly around those two specific areas. At the onset of the disaster after TC Winston, we had about 10 to 15 expertise who were mobilized within the Oxfam family to provide technical support and emergency wash and emergency food security here in Fiji. So it's looking at the entirety of the response, whether it's around assessment, whether it's looking at logistics and operations, as well as the development of specific interventions relating to those two areas that I had talked about. The thing is, Gwen, that Oxfam does not implement directly. We believe that there are local partners and organizations that we need to support who then become the first responders in any of our humanitarian work. And that was one of the key things that we did, was to identify local organizations who have the capacity to be able to carry out some of the work around emergency wash and emergency food security. And these are also the organizations who know the communities, who understand the culture, who can work within these social structures, who understand the key influences, who are really, really important in making sure that the response is tailored, that it's meeting the needs and the issues of the communities who are worst affected.
Of course, we have to hear that story from you a little later on the villagers of Nakinda Netasiri who are adopted as humanitarians. But right now, just share with us the work that you do, on the ground. Were the areas you visited, were they accessible by roads? The items transported, some with 2-liter gallon drums, How far even were these places from the drop-off points?
Oxfam is known to work in places that are not accessible. So where there is a community that's located, right at the edge of a cliff, we don't use that as an excuse not to reach them. So for us, it's a very reason why we have to look at means and ways of trying to reach these affected communities. So for Tropical Cyclone Winston, we specifically worked in 6 provinces. So from Vanuatu, the islands in between Vanuatu and Viti Levu, Maitaus from Lamai Viti, as well as the specific provinces, about 3 provinces here in Viti Levu. I think when one of our, case study has been the work that we carried out in Naitasiri. I'm targeting this particular village who don't have access by road, that you can only reach by a 6-hour trekking or on bamboo raft. And despite all of that, who have been able to get back some normalcy around water hygiene and sanitation just by their sheer commitment. And this is just really, really an important message for us for World Humanitarian Day, that when we are talking about humanitarian workers, we are talking about these villagers and community members who are at the forefront and who often are at the center of these responses, and who not only bear the brunt, but who also are the first responders in terms of a disaster. So really the Nakinda experience is an example of how the communities just got together and just made sure that they were adding value to the technical assistance that Oxfam and their partners were bringing to the village. And often this becomes an important component of the discussion around localization, and that's a big thing in humanitarian at the moment, that we need to localize our humanitarian response. What that simply means, Gwen, is that we need to understand and we need to learn how the communities respond to in times of disasters. We know that here in Fiji, we have functional systems and processes in place in these villages. We have leadership. We have the Turangani chorus who often take on the first leadership role after a disaster. There is clear division of labor straight after disaster. You have a group of people who naturally move into the food space and mobilize food. You have others who then focus on shelter. You have other people who look at their water needs. So this clear demarcation of roles and responsibilities become really, really important when we are talking about the localization of a response. So it's not just about external expertise coming in to run the show. It's also respecting the fact that you have functional systems and processes in place that must be put at the forefront of these responses.
There was a question that I also posed to Mr. Yet, like how you're engaging the community as partners. Do you believe this is also reforming the way humanitarian work is being done?
Absolutely, and in a really, really big way. And I'm really, really glad that our representative from UNICEF Pacific talked about the importance of localized expertise and leadership, because like I said, Gwen, they are at the center of a disaster. They are often the first responders. They understand the situation better than anybody else. How do we make sure that we are embracing that learning and experience in a way that it shapes the way that we bring the humanitarian response to people who need them most?
And, also as a build-up to World Humanitarian Day on the 19th of August, we're talking to Joseva Salandoka, who is the Oxfam Fiji Country Director, and we're also recognizing how humanitarians are at the heart of work done on the ground and in terms of Fiji during natural disasters. Joseph, I'd love to believe that we all have humanitarian character, but, like I had said earlier, some of us can't carry the wounded or relief supplies probably across, rivers. What does it take to do humanitarian work?
Gwen, I think you'll surprise yourself if you get caught up in one of those situations. It's just a human response. I think humanitarian action. It's a human response of wanting to be accountable and to be responsible to people and to the communities who are most affected. So I think that's that drives a lot of humanitarian responses. And I think that is why it's really, really important that while we are focusing World Humanitarian Day to humanitarian workers, we must also understand that humanitarian workers are not normally people like me, for example, who sit in air-conditioned offices and who get regular salary and who get trained to do some of these things. There are people out there who are responding to these disasters who also need to be recognized. They are the ones, I think, who need to be brought to the front of this discussion, because without us, it does not mean that there is a response not happening in an affected, impacted community. These are the people who will do something to their loved ones, if they get struck by cyclone or earthquake or any of the disasters that are quite common here in Fiji.
We thank Oxfam as well for the work that the humanitarian work that they're doing, and also just reminding our viewers and listeners that in recognition of World Humanitarian Day, a Pacific Humanitarian Heroes photo exhibition will be set up at the FNPF Downtown Boulevard. That's on the 18th, 20th, and also the 24th of August. Well, the UN General Assembly designated the 19th of August as World Humanitarian Day, and on the show we're speaking to the Oxfam Fiji Country Director, Joseva Salandoka. Joseva, was interesting because you had spoke earlier on being inclusive. So tell us about how you're able to reach people during an emergency response, the minority groups as well.
Okay. I think one thing that I think we have struggled with in our response here in Fiji as well as in the Pacific is just to make sure that we are reflecting the diversity of the communities in the way that we formulate the response and take that response across the communities that needs it. And by that I mean that when we're developing interventions, we want to make sure that it's targeted, that it's reflective of that diversities, because within a community, not everybody is the same. Not only that you have men and women, there exist the sexual and gender minorities. So you're talking about, the LGBTQI plus community. You're also referring to people living with disability, the older people as well as women and girls. How do we make sure that in the way that we are developing our response, that it's reflective of these diverse needs? One of the things I noted in 2016 that in the work that we were doing for Tropical Cyclone Winston was that even though that we were doing really, really well in trying to reach men and women and children, there wasn't much conversation around, particularly the work around sexual and gender minority. That prompted something for us, is that we need to know a little bit more about what is going on within the LGBTQI plus community. And how do we make sure that that discussion is brought to the national level, so the different clusters within the National Disaster Management Office, for example, are taking into consideration these specific needs. So what happened was that we then did, together with a local NGO partner, Rainbow Pride, and with the support of an Australian consultant, that we did a quick, rapid assessment on the needs and issues of sexual and gender minorities during a disaster. So this was talking to them about their experience after Tropical Cyclone Winston. And some of the key findings from that research was, one, some issues were not new, but nevertheless eye-opening for those who are hearing it for the first time. The whole issue of gender-based violence popped up again, that in a lot of, during the time of a disaster, it can also fuel violence. A lot of the members of the communities do not feel safe. They are not able to access the kind of support that is provided. For example, if they were to go to the evacuation centers, they are worried that they are not able to access the basic services available in the evacuation center. For example, do I go to the men's toilet or do I go to the women's toilet? For a lot of people that may sound a little bit simplistic, but these are some real issues that a lot of people within the sexual and gender minorities face. Also in terms of the way that we distribute resources. Saying, for example, if we were giving out hygiene kits, and within these hygiene kits, we will have things like sanitary pads, we will, and other dignity materials that are normally tailored for men and women, and sometimes people who come from the sexual and gender minorities don't know whether this is something that they can also access. The issue of shelter also came up quite strongly. I've talked about the evacuation centers as some of the things they are not able to access. Some of them basically don't know where to go when a disaster strikes. So this research has allowed us to build on some evidence and to advocate across the different sectors as to how we want to make sure that in the way that we are doing our assessment, in the way that we are shaping our interventions, that it's truly reflective of the needs and issues of the different pockets of populations that we have in Fiji. That it's not only, we are not caught up in just talking about being a man and a woman. There is a range of key populations that we need to be reaching out to because they have very specific needs.
When you're talking about gender-based violence, are you working with other partners and looking at how to address this?
Absolutely. With it, I think the wonderful thing about the National Disaster Management Office is the way that they've revamped the intercluster system. So you have different clusters who focus on very specific things. Saying, for example, Oxfam and our partners are quite prominent in the WASH cluster because that's where you address issues of water, hygiene, and sanitation. You also have the safety and protection cluster where some of these issues are being talked about. The thing is that, Gwen, that the whole discussion around sexual and gender minority and disaster is a new thing that's evolving. And this is something that we continue to advocate across the different clusters, that when they're doing their assessments, when they're trying to mobilize resources, it's taking into account all these different key populations that we need to be targeting during and after disaster.
You spoke about you being part of the cluster group. Maybe you could just elaborate a bit more on that. You're part of the, Oxfam is part of the Pacific Humanitarian team?
Yes, part of our role in the Pacific Humanitarian team is to convene and to make sure that the different international NGOs are talking to each other. One of the things that the acting RES rep alluded to was making sure that there is no duplication and overlaps in the way that we do things. And that is an important role that Oxfam plays. It's just making sure that everybody's talking to each other, that each organization know what the other people are doing, and that we understand the geographical coverage of the work that we are doing and whom that we are targeting, so then there is better use of the resources that we have got. I was quite interested. I couldn't help but hear the description that was given by the resident rep on NGOs parachuting in after disaster. It's not just not only NGOs; it's everybody. Everybody just shoot into an emergency situation, and obviously trying to help out and just making sure that some sense of normalcy is brought into the local population. But at the same time, it's really, really important that that is coordinated. And I think that is one of the roles that we also play within the NGO space, is making sure that the left basically knows what the right is doing, and that each NGO are talking to each other and sharing resources about the kind of work that they're doing on the ground.
Speaking to us then is Chovesa Salandoka, the Oxfam Fiji Country Director. Thank you so much for your time. And also, World Humanitarian Day will be observed on the 19th of August. And again, we're reminding you to go and visit the Pacific Humanitarian Heroes photo exhibition, which will be set up at the FNPF Downtown Boulevard on the 18th, 20th, and 24th of August. Chovesa, I thank you again for your time. And this is Speak Your Mind. We're wrapping up again for another Tuesday.